Tonight, the leaders of the Cherokee Nation are speaking out against Senator Elizabeth Warren's campaign video touting her Native American ancestry courtesy of a newly revealed DNA test. The tribe saying in part, quote, "A DNA test is useless to determine tribal citizenship."
A new DNA study has just revealed that the Cherokee people weren't who we thought they were, and what it uncovered has forced scientists to completely rewrite one of the most accepted stories in North American history. For generations, historians, archaeologists, and geneticists believed they had the Cherokee origin story figured out. The evidence seemed solid, the timeline seemed settled. Then this study looked deeper than anyone had before, and the entire framework cracked. Not around the edges, at the foundation. The data pointed somewhere that made no sense under the old model, connected the Cherokee to a population and a place nobody expected, and raised questions the field is still scrambling to answer.
They didn't come from Siberia or across some land bridge from Asia. They came from Europe.
This is not a minor revision to the historical record. This is the kind of discovery that changes what we thought we knew about who the Cherokee are, where they came from, and how long the real story has been hiding in plain sight. The science of origins. The Southern Appalachians have always looked like a place people were meant to stay. Ridgelines stacked to the horizon, each one a shade darker than the last. Hardwood forests burning gold and copper in the October light. Western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, the high valleys of northern Georgia. For thousands of years, this was the heart of Cherokee country. And for most of that time, the dominant assumption seemed almost self-evident.
This exhibit is an opportunity for Cherokee people to tell true Cherokee stories.
The Cherokee had always been here. Their villages were here, their mounds were here, their rivers carved through these mountains for as long as the stories went back. Southeastern people, local roots. That assumption held for a very long time. Here's the catch. Cherokee belongs to the Iroquoian language family, and the moment you look at a map, that fact becomes deeply uncomfortable. Every other Iroquoian language in North America, Mohawk, Seneca, Oneida, Tuscarora, Cayuga, was spoken by peoples living more than 800 miles to the north and east. Great Lakes country, upstate New York, the St. Lawrence Valley. The Cherokee sat alone in the deep south, speaking a tongue that had no business being there, cut off from every linguistic relative by the full width of the Appalachian chain and 8 centuries of geography. Linguists noticed this in the 19th century and never stopped being bothered by it. They estimated that the Cherokee diverged from northern Iroquoian groups roughly 3,500 to 4,000 years ago, placing the split in what archaeologists call the late Archaic period. But linguistics could only take the question so far. It couldn't tell you who moved, in what numbers, or over what terrain. That's what DNA was supposed to answer. And when the data came in, the Cherokee weren't who we thought they were, not even close. The 5th lineage.
Among the various populations in American history, Cherokee Nation is widely regarded as one of the most well-documented indigenous communities ever.
Here's what nobody talks about in the popular version of Native American genetic history. When researchers first began systematically cataloging Native American mitochondrial DNA, the framework they constructed looked almost elegant. 4 founding haplogroups, labeled A, B, C, and D, each traceable to East Asian source populations, each fully consistent with an ancestral crossing from Siberia into the Americas through Beringia during the last ice age, roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago. Approximately 97% of all Native American maternal lineages fit cleanly into those 4 categories. The model worked. Papers were published, textbooks were printed, a coherent picture of continental peopling settled into place. Then the remaining 3% broke everything. A 5th lineage kept appearing in the data, haplogroup X, and haplogroup X was not behaving the way the other 4 did. Now pay attention here, because this is the part that gets misrepresented constantly, and the misrepresentation does real damage. Haplogroups A through D all have well-documented close relatives in East Asian populations. That's the expected pattern for lineages that cross through Beringia. It's what gives the 4 haplogroup model its explanatory power. But the Native American version of haplogroup X does not have its closest relatives concentrated in East Asia. Its closest relatives are found in Europe and Western Asia, the Middle East, the Caucasus region, Every few years, someone tries to weaponize that fact to argue that Native Americans are secretly European, or that ancient Israelites somehow crossed the Atlantic, or any number of theories designed to undermine indigenous identity and complicate treaty rights. None of that is what the science shows, at all. What the science actually shows is both more rigorous and more extraordinary than any of those fantasies. In 1999, two separate research teams published landmark studies almost simultaneously. Michael Brown and his colleagues at Emory University in Atlanta had been independently tracking haplogroup X across Native American populations, building their data set carefully over years, checking and rechecking the signal. At the same time, David Glenn Smith and his team at the University of California, Davis, were doing the same thing, independently, without coordination, working toward the same wall of data. Both groups published within months of each other, and both reached the same conclusion. The Native American X lineage, specifically designated X2A in the genetic literature, is real. It is not European contamination from colonial contact. It is not the product of post-1492 mixing with European populations. The X2, a lineage diverged from its Eurasian counterpart at least 15,000 years ago, probably considerably more than that. That date is the critical detail. It means haplogroup X was already a fully distinct lineage before any human being set foot in the Americas for the first time. Whatever founding population carried it, they brought it with them during the original. That migration? It belongs here as completely as haplogroups A, B, C, and D. And get this. When Smith's team at Davis mapped the continental distribution of haplogroup X across native North American populations, the geographic pattern that emerged was striking. The lineage was not spread evenly across the continent. It concentrated heavily in one specific region, the Great Lakes, among Algonquian and Iroquoian-speaking peoples, and it appeared at lower but clearly notable frequencies in Cherokee populations. The same geographic footprint that the linguistic evidence had already traced, now showing up again in a completely independent line of data. Two separate disciplines, two separate data sets, pointing at the same map. If that's the kind of convergence you follow, the moment when independent evidence starts stacking up toward the same answer, then this channel is exactly where you should be. We go where the data goes, even when it gets uncomfortable. Subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. The largest data set ever built. 3 years after those haplogroup X studies, Ripan Malhi at the University of California, Davis, the same researcher whose map we opened on, undertook something that nobody had attempted at that scale. He and his team assembled mitochondrial DNA from across the entire continent, pulling together data from dozens of distinct populations spanning the Arctic to the Gulf Coast. Not one tribe, not one region, 1,612 mitochondrial DNA samples from native North Americans, 395 full sequences of the hypervariable segment, the largest continental genetic data set of its kind ever constructed at that point. Years of collection, years of analysis, all converging on a single continental picture. When the team ran spatial autocorrelation analysis, plotting haplogroup frequencies against geography and looking for statistically meaningful clusters, the continent organized itself into 3 distinct zones. Haplogroup A populations had undergone prehistoric expansions across the Arctic North. Haplogroup B populations had expanded through the southwest. And haplogroup X populations, the anomalous 5th lineage, the one that wasn't supposed to be there, had expanded around the Great Lakes. Picture it as a visualization. A map of North America with markers showing where each haplogroup concentrates. The Great Lakes region lighting up for haplogroup X. Now overlay a second map. One showing the pre-contact distribution of Iroquoian languages before European contact reshaped the entire eastern half of the continent. The overlap is not approximate, it is precise. Here's the deal. And this is where the Cherokee origin question stops being abstract. The reason haplogroup X is significant for Cherokee origins isn't simply that Cherokee people carry it. It's that the continental distribution of haplogroup X overlaps precisely with the region where linguists place Proto-Iroquoian, the ancestral language that eventually split into Mohawk, Seneca, Oneida, Cayuga, Tuscarora, and Cherokee, before the Cherokee branch diverged and began its long southward migration. The Great Lakes Corridor, the Northeast, the very territory that Cherokee oral traditions themselves describe as a homeland that existed before the people moved into the mountains. This is not one data point. This is 3 independent lines of evidence: linguistics, population genetics, and oral tradition, converging on the same geographic coordinates, pointing to the same origin, describing the same migration. 3 different tools built by 3 different disciplines across 3 different centuries, all drawing the same map. The Arikara discovery. In 2011, confirmation arrived from a direction nobody had anticipated. At Washington State University, Deborah Lawrence and Brian Kemp were running what looked like a contained regional study. They had access to skeletal remains from 3 Arikara village sites along the Missouri River in South Dakota, sites that had been occupied between 1600 and 1832. The Arikara speak a Caddoan language, a completely different family from Iroquoian and completely different from Siouan languages as well. On paper, there was no compelling reason to expect any meaningful connection to the Cherokee. No shared geography, no shared language family, no documented cultural relationship. Lawrence and Kemp extracted mitochondrial DNA from 63 samples. 55 yielded usable genetic data, an 87% success rate that reflects exceptional preservation conditions in the northern plains soil. The haplogroup frequencies came back at roughly expected proportions for a plains population: 42% A, 29% B, 22% C, 7% D. That's not the finding. The finding came when the team ran principal coordinates analysis, a statistical method that places populations in multi-dimensional space based on overall genetic profile similarity. Think of each population as a point in a room. Populations with shared ancestry cluster together. Populations with divergent histories spread apart. When the Arikara data was plotted, the results came back in a way that stopped people. The Arikara clustered closest to 2 other populations: Siouan-speaking peoples and the Cherokee, not the Pawnee, their nearest geographic and cultural neighbors on the plains. Not the Mandan, who lived on the same river system and had been trading partners for generations. The Arikara's deepest maternal genetic affinities pointed hundreds of miles away to groups that shared essentially nothing obvious in terms of geography, economy, or language family. Here's what nobody expected this to do. There's a long-contested hypothesis in linguistics called the macro-Iroquoian theory, which proposes that Iroquoian, Siouan, and Caddoan languages all descend from a single, very ancient common ancestor. A deep linguistic unity that predates the divergence of every documented language family in the eastern half of the continent. Most linguists had treated the hypothesis with considerable skepticism, and not without reason. The proposed connections are remote and difficult to demonstrate under the standards of conventional comparative linguistics methodology. Lawrence and Kemp's genetic data did not prove the macro-Iroquoian theory, but it made dismissing it substantially harder than it had been before. Think carefully about what that actually means. 3 groups separated by hundreds of miles, speaking languages from 3 supposedly unrelated families, living in 3 distinct ecological zones, and their deep maternal lineages reaching back to a shared ancestral population. Not the shallow shared ancestry that comes from trade networks or generations of intermarriage, but the deep ancient kind, the kind that predates the languages themselves, that predates the cultural divergence, that reaches back to a time before any of these peoples had names for themselves. What the evidence actually means. Taken together, this is what the evidence shows. Cherokee maternal lineages carry the genetic signature of a northern origin, specifically the Great Lakes Corridor, consistent with a substantial southward population movement into the Appalachian Highlands, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. The old assumption that the Cherokee were a purely in-place southeastern population whose roots were entirely local cannot survive contact with this data. The haplogroup X concentration in the Great Lakes region, the continental scale genetic clustering that places Cherokee populations in relationship to northern Iroquoian groups, and the Arikara findings pointing toward deep ancient connections across supposed language family boundaries. None of these patterns can be produced by a people who never left the mountains, What it implies is genuinely extraordinary. A population movement large enough to establish both a language and a measurable genetic signature in the southern Appalachians occurred during the late Archaic period, reshaping the cultural geography of the entire Southeast long before the Mississippian civilization, the great mound centers, or the complex regional exchange networks arose. But here's the part I need to be direct about, because presenting this as a closed case would be dishonest. The skeptics have legitimate points. Mitochondrial DNA traces only one line of descent, through mothers. It says nothing about paternal ancestry, nothing about autosomal DNA, nothing about the complete genetic portrait of a population. A group can carry northern maternal lineages and simultaneously maintain deep local roots through other lines of descent. Admixture is complicated, and mitochondrial data alone cannot cleanly distinguish between a large-scale, directional migration and centuries of sustained intermarriage between neighboring peoples moving gradually southward. And get this, there's a sampling problem woven into the data that goes deeper than methodology alone. The vast majority of Cherokee DNA studies have drawn from modern Oklahoma Cherokee populations. But the Trail of Tears in 1838 forcibly relocated approximately 16,000 Cherokee people from their southeastern homeland to Indian Territory, and an estimated 4,000 of them died during the march, 1 in 4 people. That is a catastrophic population bottleneck, and population bottlenecks reshape genetic diversity in ways that are genuinely difficult to untangle from underlying historical signals. The genetic profile of the surviving Oklahoma Cherokee population may overrepresent lineages whose carriers happened to survive the removal, and underrepresent lineages that were lost. A lineage that was rare before 1838 could appear common in modern datasets. A lineage that was widespread could be gone entirely. The eastern band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina, descendants of those who avoided removal, represents a different genetic window into pre-contact diversity. But that population is small, and the sampling has been far more limited. This is where the story becomes genuinely frustrating. The evidence that would cleanly resolve the outstanding questions barely exists in the scientific literature yet. The evidence sitting underground. The answers the field needs are ancient DNA from pre-contact archaeological sites in the Cherokee homeland. That evidence could tell us whether the migration was a single large movement or a gradual multi-generational process, when specific lineages arrived and in what proportions, and whether Mississippian cultural contact reshaped Cherokee genetic diversity before European arrival. The questions are specific. The methodology exists. The technology is already there. Researchers have extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from remains across the Americas, including the 12,600-year-old Anzac child in Montana, whose complete genome confirmed that the earliest Americans are genetically ancestral to all living native peoples. The laboratory infrastructure can extract usable genetic material from remains thousands of years old. The statistical frameworks can distinguish directional migration from multi-century admixture processes. What doesn't yet exist in sufficient quantity is trust, and that is not a failure of the Cherokee Nation. It's the entirely rational product of history. For decades, genetic studies on indigenous peoples were conducted without informed consent. Samples were taken from ancestral remains without community permission. Results were published that contradicted oral traditions or were deliberately used to challenge land claims in federal courts. The Cherokee Nation now maintains strict protocols governing any genetic research involving their citizens or their ancestors. Any ancient DNA study in the Cherokee homeland must be built as a genuine partnership from the start, with the community directing the questions, controlling the data, and determining how findings are shared. Several such partnerships are reportedly in development. That matters beyond Cherokee history. It's a model for how genetic science and indigenous sovereignty can work together.
We get tons of inquiries. Probably the top inquiry we get are people wanting to do DNA tests to determine what tribe they belong to.
Here's what nobody talks about loudly enough. The explosion of commercial DNA testing has flooded the public conversation with misunderstandings about Cherokee identity. Millions of Americans have claimed Cherokee ancestry based on consumer results that don't work the way people think. Those kits compare your DNA against reference panels. and Native American reference panels are notoriously thin, because tribal nations have largely declined to contribute their genetic data to commercial databases. A consumer test cannot tell you whether you are Cherokee. The real science, conducted through institutional partnerships, controlled sampling, and community consent, operates on an entirely different level. That is the science rewriting this origin story. The journey ahead, right now, beneath the soil of the southern Appalachians, there are archaeological sites containing the physical evidence of one of the most significant prehistoric migrations in North American history. The bones are there. The DNA is preserved in the cold dark of the earth, patient as geology, waiting for the partnerships and the trust that will make it possible to read. The Cherokee Nation today has more than 450,000 citizens. It operates its own government with its own legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It runs language revitalization programs for a tongue the world cannot afford to lose. And it is increasingly engaging with genetic science on its own terms, not as a community under study, but as a sovereign partner, directing priorities, shaping questions, deciding what knowledge is worth seeking, and how it gets used. The Cherokee have always known they came from the north. Their Kituwa traditions, the deep origin stories that predate any contact with European science or European categories of knowledge, described a homeland beyond the mountains, a people who came from the north and made the Appalachians their own. It took Western science 3,500 years of accumulated linguistic puzzles, 2 decades of mitochondrial mapping across thousands of samples, the development of ancient DNA extraction technology, and the painstaking construction of continental-scale genetic datasets to arrive at the same place the oral traditions were already standing. The Cherokee weren't who we thought they were. The foundations of the accepted southeastern origin story have been systematically dismantled by language, by genetics, by ancient memory, and by DNA, work that is only just beginning to reach its full potential. The question now isn't where the Cherokee came from. That answer is becoming clearer with every study, every partnership, every careful extraction from ancient ground. The question is what the journey actually looked like. How many people? How many generations? Which routes? Which seasons? Which hardships? Which arrivals? What they found when they finally reached the mountains? Who was already there? What was negotiated and absorbed and contested across the centuries as the Cherokee established the homeland that European contact would eventually try to take from them? Those answers are coming, and for the first time in the history of that search, the people whose ancestors made the journey are the ones leading it. If you want to be here when the next piece of the story breaks, subscribe and don't go anywhere, because we're not done yet.